Hi everybody, I'm delighted to be joining such a wonderful group this afternoon, having such an important conversation for society. I'm Sinead O'Carroll, the editor of the journal, and the third panel has been put together to really bring the positive and constructive side of this conversation out. We'll be looking at examples of best international practice of media, while also exploring ways that we as the media can integrate, represent and nurture young people and talent as we go about our work. And we have some brilliant minds who can tell us what ideas could work for Ireland, keeping not just the publishers but an audience in mind too. Sarah Arnold from Maynooth University joins us, as well as Atte Jääskeläinen, a former broadcaster and currently of the Ministry of Education and Culture in Finland, and from the University of South Wales, Ruth McElroy. Each will give a short presentation of their ideas, which come from their areas of expertise, and then we'll kick into some questions from me, but also questions from the audience as well. Sarah, we're going to kickstart with you, so if you can lend us your mind and your expertise now, that would be great.
Oh, thanks very much, Sinead. And so I'm kind of speaking in my capacity as somebody who kind of observes media consumption habits of young people and also kind of looks at the outcomes of people who are in media production courses. And so in preparation for this, I was looking through the Future of Media Commission public consultation, the responses to that, and it was interesting to note the lack of reference to young people as key stakeholders of public service media. And RTE, in its submission, it could acknowledge that young people are digital natives, they consume media across different platforms, but it seemed a bit of a loss about how to retain and increase engagement and investment from young people. And in lots of other responses as well, there seemed to be a marginalization of young people in the kind of narratives about the future of media. I think radio was one of the few areas where young people were represented at all. And I think in some ways young people should be pretty central to thinking about policy related to the future of media more general, and then the public service media more specifically, because they're real uptakers of media technologies. They consume lots of kind of media across different types of platforms and lots of different content. They're trailblazers in many ways, and they show us what trends are going to become the future norms. So they're kind of a litmus test for media consumption and production in the future. So I'd say that relative to the importance of young people, there's been a lot less effort to bring public service media to them in the kind of spaces that they're in. And this is despite the fact that young people really enjoy media. They consume an awful lot of it, and they produce an awful lot of it. And in a European Broadcasting Union report, as well as a recent Ofcom report on the international perspectives of public service broadcasting, they both acknowledge that young people are real avid media consumers and producers, but they also said that public service media providers weren't meeting them on the platforms nor providing the content that they like, that young people like. So, for example, young people are often noted to consume less news. And this is demonstrated in studies of traditional public service media and youth news consumption. But young people have been demonstrated to consume news and information on platforms like Instagram, and they look at lots of public service media in the pandemic. So it's not necessarily the case that they don't consume news. Maybe it's just a case that they're consuming news in a very different way than has been traditionally understood or provided by public service media. And also public service media providers, for them, gaining the attention of young audiences is made even more difficult when the very platforms that young people enjoy, social media platforms like TikTok or YouTube, they've mastered the use of data gathering techniques and algorithms designed to retain their attention. So it's really difficult for public service media to keep up with this. And also, if we know that young people's media preferences are primarily targeted, at digitally located, and they like diverse forms of content, then what can be done to attract them? And quite often broadcasters, for example, will talk about how to draw young audiences back into fairly conventional, established, programs and platforms and so on. And that seems like a really uphill battle. That's not, as young people get older, that's not the space they're going to be in. They're going to be kind of increasingly moving towards newer forms of content delivery. But I know I've been talking quite negatively up till now, but I think there have been some success stories in terms of developing that relationship between young people and public service media and getting them invested very early in public service media so that they kind of continue that into later years. And generally, the case studies that I talk about are related to, on the one hand, media content that's really responsive to the interests of young people, also on media platforms and distribution that young people are at. And then media production, I think, is really important as well, that young people are involved in media production and have a knowledge about it so that they're going to be attracted to public service media and they're going to be retained in that kind of ecosystem. So, for example, public service media providers can use extensive research to understand young audiences and their interests. And there's a really good example of this in Norwegian broadcaster NRK, where they, in their program, the drama series Scam, they use really extensive audience research, school visits, social media scanning, interviewing young people before they even started script writing. And that informed how they produced the story. So it was really embedded in the interests and kind of the concerns of young people. And as well as interesting or kind of gaining their interest in terms of content, the program was also delivered online and in ways that adopted some of the features of transmedia, so storytelling across platforms, storytelling in the spaces that young people are and spaces they use, the platforms that they use. So young audiences were reached by delivering the content they requested on the platforms they liked, but all while retaining that public service ethos. And there's been lots of examples, for example, from broadcasters in the Netherlands, where they kind of really embed young people in storytelling mechanisms, that they bring young people in to produce media themselves rather than just produce it for them. And in addition, it's been demonstrated that young people are really information seeking in the use of media. So for example, they seek out answers to questions on search engines, they view how-to videos on YouTube, and there's a whole ecology of information-rich short-form content that's exploited that. But public service media has been really slow to respond to that. And there was a Navigating Youth Media report of 2020 that suggested that this information-seeking behaviour could be supported and nurtured by public service media. An example of that might be, I think it was Germany's public service broadcaster ARD, which told the story of the Berlin Wall in an initiative that was specifically aimed at young audiences. And part of that story was told through the use of a kind of historical character, but the story is told across social media. And it was also told on Snapchat, where users could use things like augmented reality to look at the events of the 9th of November. And I suppose, just to move on to my final point then about, to move away from content and distribution and to think a little bit about production. I think that in Ireland, we don't really have an engagement with young people in the production of public service media. There's very few work placement opportunities, very few kind of opportunities to do internships. And in fact, a lot of the internships that are advertised are there for US or non-Irish young people or students. And as somebody who lectures on a general media course, what's apparent is that young people are migrating countries. So they're moving out of Ireland in order to take up roles elsewhere, or they're moving to media adjacent sectors, and they're giving up on things like public service media because they just don't see themselves in there. And I think organizations like, the Channel 4 in the UK is an example. Their remit is to include young people, to include marginalised communities and marginalised, populations. And they've got all these training and placements and all these schemes that are developed for including people and including young people. So young people are really present in that media production ecosystem. But closer to home, we have a few sporadic initiatives. We've got some good Irish language initiatives, like in TG Cahir, of getting young people into media production. And there's really good examples in Wales as well. But for the bigger organisations, they're not so many. And so there's a risk that young people see it as inaccessible. In a study that I've done on our own students, our own graduates, they see it as really elitist. They don't see themselves in there. And I think earlier Bashir noted that there's a lack of diversity in Irish media. And that lack of diversity is particularly relevant to the younger populations that are more diverse and increasingly diverse, and they're not represented in media. So it's seen as a little bit kind of pale, male and stale from young people's perspectives. So I think they're the kind of 3 points that I just wanted to hit upon. They kind of need to think about content, platforms and production as well. So I don't necessarily have any big solutions, but I think there are examples of good practice, but there needs to be a much bigger commitment from public service media providers if they're going to retain these audiences in the future.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And yeah, we need to ask the questions before we can get to the solutions parts. I think that's part of these critical conversations that we're having. I have a few questions to come back to you on, but I'll ask Ruth to give her presentation next.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks, Sarah. That was really, really interesting. I want to concentrate on a few different areas, but today, as some of you may know, is election day here in Wales. I haven't yet managed to get out of my house to vote, but I think today's election is particularly significant for 2 reasons. The first of which is I don't think we've ever been at a point in Wales where the reality of devolved policymaking has been so widely felt and known by ordinary voters. And COVID, I think, has transformed the political and public understanding of what disinformation looks like and what poor quality news looks like. And I think it's brought very legitimate and overdue pressure on public service media, including the BBC, to do better. I think it has also shone a light on how the media helps to keep us apart. So today is also my mother-in-law's birthday. And one thing that she's started to do a lot in lockdown is she's started to text me with news stories that she's seen from Wales. This is a bit odd to me. And I asked her, why are you doing this? You know, I am in Wales, I am watching it. And she said, well, because I've actually found it. Because I found it because you told me I could go on iPlayer and I could see these things. Now, this is one of the problems. The technology is keeping us apart as well as pulling us together. So somebody in the first panel made the point of how do you find the content? I think it was Rosemary. One of the problems, I think, in a country like the UK, multinational, multi-level governments, is that actually the media is not allowing us to understand what is happening in different constituencies. So we don't understand what's happening in Scotland. We don't necessarily understand what's happening in Wales. But because England is so dominant, England stops functioning as a nation. It is simply Britain. You know, that's a very long-standing argument in Wales. The second reason why this election is so important in Wales, it's the first time that 16 and 17-year-olds are going to get to vote. And I think that this speaks to the points that Sarah and Anya and many people have been making about how important good quality information is for young people. So there are two key areas I want to focus on. One is picking up on some of Sarah's conversation around skills. So one of the things that I think has been really problematic is a move in many ways towards increasingly putting the burden on workers to be the authors of their own upskilling and continuous training. I think that one of the problems with that is it has meant that we have got to a point where the media is getting more exclusionary as a workforce, not less. In fact, that goes so far as to say we're managing to bake exclusion in. So I prefer to talk about it in terms of exclusion and inclusion rather than diversity, because I think there's agency here and there's responsibility. It isn't an accident. There are moves within the UK and within Wales, certainly, to try and have initiatives that deal with some of that. And I think these are really important. So, for example, we have seen how the public service broadcasters, including S4C as the Welsh language public service broadcaster, has worked on something called Fast Track Factual, which has particularly been trying to encourage new producers into the industry and in a sense giving them access to commissioners. I think what's quite interesting in the conversation so far is commissioners have been relatively absent from the conversation, and yet commissioners I think are the most powerful group of people, even though mostly they can fit within a mini really. So more investigation and questioning of commissioners I think is a good thing. So I think one of the issues around skills for us has been this exclusionary tendency to focus on people upskilling themselves, a tendency to rely on recruitment practices that are who's in my phone, yeah, who's in my contact lists, and absolutely what that leads to is homogeneity. And that homogeneity, I think, can also be seen at different levels. It isn't just an entry-level issue. It's there at business leader level in terms of the production sector. It's there also, I think, really importantly, at the level of governance. So what do your boards look like? How inclusionary are they? How exclusionary are they? Now, I think where this starts to really come to the fore is in terms of the relationship, which is not linear, is not straightforward, between who are the producers and what kind of content are they making on screen. One of the other areas that I think is really interesting when you look at minority language media is, quite rightly, we often focus on scale, as though smaller organizations are necessarily less agile or less able to create. And yet in many cases, I think the opposite is true. So I want to just shine a light on two examples. The first of which is a series called Hansh, H-A-N-S-H, which is created by S4C. And this fascinates me because it's had quite a long sort of development period from initial content to actually being a kind of whole series of content now that happens online on YouTube, but is also then made as a kind of summary show for transmission. So what's interesting about something like Hansh, I think, is the ethos to go to where audiences are rather than to complain about why they're not coming to you. Secondly, it's the fact that what they've tried to create is online content as online content. In other words, not creating a program and then cutting it up to a shorter segment, but actually thinking about the affordances and creative affordances of online content as a form in and of itself. And then thirdly, what they've tried to do is to give voice to audiences. And I think this is quite a big shift in how we have some of our thinking, but historically there are lots of earlier examples, and I really valued Rosemary's point at the start. So public service media here can be conceived of as an enabler of voices, not just as a transmitter. It's whose voice do we allow us, the rest of the public, to hear? How can we do more of that? What do we need to do to make those voices heard more? And it's working against that exclusionary bias, I think. So in a recent piece of research that we did on the Cardiff Capital Region, we found, for example, that 86% of independent screen industry organisations reported recruiting through word of mouth. And then it's no surprise that we found those people we were interviewing from Black and minority ethnic populations were saying, I don't see myself reflected. But that's also true, I think, in terms of socioeconomic exclusion, and also perhaps most true in terms of disability. So the final example that I want to look at is what I think is a really interesting example of working across silos. So some of you might be aware that S4C and BBC Wales have been working together in co-productions of what in Wales we term back-to-back production. That is drama series that are produced and shot first in Welsh and then in English to create very different versions of the same core IP. We have a company that we are supporting through Cluster at the moment, which is working in this space. But what we've also tried to facilitate is some of the great practice that is happening in some of our theatre companies, who I think in many ways are much further ahead in addressing some of the issues of inclusion, and in particular looking at inclusive film casting. So they're working on a production at the moment, trying to think about how to cast disabled actors, or more specifically, how to cast learning disabled actors in ways that genuinely reflect diversity, avoid stereotypes. And this involves really some quite profound work in investing in training, working in partnership, and above all, providing really valuable experiences to the people who are involved in the media. So that model, I think, much more of co-creation and working across silos is something that I think we really can be inspired by. Okay.
Thanks so much for that, Ruth. It's so much provocative stuff there for us to dive into. And just to remind people that they can use the Q&A box if they have any questions for Sarah, Ruth, or Atte. And Atte, I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you. I tried to take a systemic approach to this challenge, and the way I'm trying to do that is to talk about incentives. But let me first describe how I see the main challenge of public service media, and especially the public service media in the field of journalism and news. And that we have an issue in the whole spectrum of journalism and news industry, which I would define as an oversupply, meaning that the value of the content, the value of the programming, in reality has decreased because all people have access to all information almost immediately when it's published in digital space. And that feature is especially strong among younger audiences. So the only possible solution to this fundamental value creation problem is to innovate new ways of creating value. And that means that those means of creating value are different than those invented when television was invented or when radio was invented. So there are whole new ways of telling stories. There is a whole new way of serving individual needs in this new ecosystem, which is based on new technologies, and so on and so on. But then, of course, the question is, how able are you innovate in a way that you are able to differentiate public service in this field, which is basically a kind of what could be described as a red ocean, meaning that there's a lot of blood in the water, meaning that it's not enough that you do more what is needed, where there already is an oversupply of things around. So a radical innovation and radical differentiation is needed. That's one of the basic cornerstones of strategy. And if we are talking about younger audiences, it is not enough that you innovate, and it's not enough that you differentiate. You have to innovate and differentiate in a way that creates value in their eyes, meaning that you have to create something that is relevant for them. And then we come to the question, is public service media able to renew itself? And to its ability, there is a connection to the incentive system the funding model creates. And I have a view that public service, which has been in some cases already even successful in attracting younger audiences and being relevant for them. But at the same time, I would say that in too many cases, public service media has tried to imitate commercial offering, kind of coming to the same field later and with less competence, and try to imitate something that already was invented there. So I would say that that's not the way ahead. You have to be different. You have to be you have to be public service, and you have to be it has to be mission based, I would say. And then when if the funding model is largely based on commercial models, meaning advertising, then, which by the way is not very lucrative model in digital space anyway, but if it's based on the idea, then of course the company culture, the organizational culture, one way or another starts to optimize based on where the money comes from. You have to optimize to get funded. That's the way it's organized. That's the way the life is. And therefore, I would not go into that direction. And I know that the Irish model has largely been based on quite large share of advertising income. And on a systemic level, I'm not talking about what happens in reality, but on systemic level, I would say that that would incentivize public service to be too close to commercial players, and therefore not being different as it should be to be successful in the long term. In my own country, Finland, we have a long history of license fee, and also 2 decades of full public funding, meaning that no advertising income at all. And that was changed into a tax-based model a couple of years ago. And in this model, all households, except those with very low income, pay a certain kind of earmarked tax to public service company Wiley. Well, political control and public funding is not a paradise either if you want to innovate for younger audiences, because something younger audiences would perhaps feel as relevant for them would perhaps be too innovative for politicians who tend to be a little bit older than those younger audiences. And it's not only how much the funding model gives you resources overall, it's also where you spend this money. And public service companies tend to spend 90% of their money in serving people who are over 60 years old. And whenever you try to close a program, whenever you try to stop anything that is targeted to these audiences, it suddenly becomes a core part of public service mission and totally impossible to close down and free resources to do something meaningful and really impactful for younger audiences. And I would say that, and kind of finalize my intro by referring to an innovation from Finland from 1947, after the Second World War, when there was a real threat of communism, and a Finnish public service company was led. The CEO was clearly a politician with a very kind of a red attitudes at the time when Finland was living through a period which was called the Year of Danger, meaning that the whole country was kind of expecting communism to be kind of the future model of the country after the war. And then it was agreed that all decisions about public service company in Finland should be made in parliament, not in the government. And not only that they should be made in parliament, they should be made in consensus. And in a way, this is how politicians have given away their power over monetary policy to central banks, by understanding that giving away the power to somebody who professionally takes care of one of the fundamental interests of the society, it's actually good for the society. And although that's not the case anywhere in the world, I would still propose, and especially propose this because I'm not working for public service anymore, and I'm just kind of a humble civil servant from Finnish government, not dealing with public service issues anymore. I would say that it would be an interesting idea to copy this idea of an independent central bank whose independence is guaranteed by constitution in many countries, into the role of public service, which is a fundamental kind of building block of a society, providing information and binding the nation together. And the nation can't have a future if it doesn't have kind of a common understanding of who they are and what they are trying to achieve. And therefore, I think this is quite a fundamental thing worth constitutional protection. Thank you. This was my intro.
I like that you finished on a big idea there, Atte. Thanks very much for that. So I think there's a thread that all of you have pulled on in your presentations. That, Sarah, I'll go to you first, because you're talking a lot about investment in young people. If you invest in young people, you bring that young audience with you. And probably similar, Ruth, with what you're saying with minority communities. If you invest in having them represented through your public service broadcast, then you'll probably get a new audience. That message isn't getting across. The economics of that message obviously isn't getting across. Is there anything that can be done, or any examples that you can point us to show us, actually, if you bring young people, you will get a younger audience, and therefore that will be good for your business?
Well, just to think, there's a comment actually in the questions and answers that points to Learning Waves Academy, talking about bringing TY students in to study radio and to produce some radio. And some of these initiatives have been really successful, and they engage young audiences, but only for a moment. I think they were saying in the comment there about how hard it is to get funding for those kind of initiatives. Well, we can already see that if you train people in things like community, radio, community media, if you bring them into, TY programs, whatever it might be, they get really enthusiastic about media production. But if that's not sustained, then all of the other media comes back to them. And so I think that there's these periodic efforts to provide some pots of funding here and there for these initiatives, but it's not sustained and it's not long lasting. And I think that's what needs to be done, is that you need digital literacy programs that are almost branded by public service media, that feed into these training initiatives, that public service media takes back the responsibility for things like training, and that it provides funding to all of these things like Learning Waves. But at the moment, that's not happening. And I think that's a real shame. And you can see what's happened because of the loss of all of this training and this kind of engagement with young audiences, is that there are plenty of platforms that will engage them. And we kind of talked about algorithms already. They engage young people. They're really interested in what they want and feeding them what they want. But public service media, I think, still has a kind of an idea that we know what people should have and we'll provide it. But there's a big discordance between public service media and other media, particularly the kind of technological platforms.
Yeah, Ruth, Atte says there that the public service media companies might bulk a little bit, because if the over 60s don't like it, because the 25-year-olds will, there'll be a block to actually doing it. Do you agree with that sentiment?
I think that's always a tension, but I suppose the way I think about it is it goes to the heart of the single biggest threat, bigger than Netflix, bigger than Facebook, that I think public service media faces, and that is a loss of public legitimacy. And in the end, I'm hearing in my head, what was it the Americans said? No taxation without representation. If you continue to exclude, you will eventually find that those you're excluding now have an abundance of content that they can find elsewhere. And when they're lost, they might be lost to you for a very long time. It's much easier to lose audiences than it is to build and retain them. I would hope that actually there was a bigger sense of actually wanting to do good, right? That we don't have to sort of think about loss or danger, that actually there is no reason why you wouldn't want to have more diverse content. I mean, after all, there are 60-somethings who are disabled. Actually, quite a lot. There are 60-somethings who come from working class backgrounds. There are 60-somethings from Black and minority ethnic communities. So I think we have to have that understanding of this being something that can enhance and enrich, and that actually goes to the heart of, you can't make an argument that public service media is distinctive unless part of what that distinction is around public legitimacy and serving all people, not just, those with the deepest pockets.
Yes, Sarah, is there something, and you talked about YouTube, like young people go to YouTube, they look for how-to videos, they're really information hungry. But then Atte says we shouldn't, like commercial entities, we shouldn't try and copy them as public service broadcasters, because we will only fail because people will go to commercials. So is there a balance to be had there between, RTE, say, just trying to copy a YouTube creator account to try and get young people into RTE? Like, where's the balance to be had there?
Yeah, I think that's the kind of trickiness of it, is that when those attempts have been made, they've been made as kind of poorer relatives of, what the commercial companies and organizations are doing already. And I think that's where there's kind of a need for, let's say, research and development into how young people are using media and technologies, and getting them at a young age and figuring out what's going on. So, for example, I think it's BBC have a huge research and development, department where they are looking at things like object-based broadcasting and how young people engage with that, and how there's kind of different ways of storytelling. And they're still losing youth audiences, but they're making much more of an effort to think about media through the perspective of young people. Whereas, if you just go out and try and copy YouTube kind of content creators, you already have a 12-year-old in a bedroom who's doing that quite successfully. And if RTE can't compete with that, you're in real trouble. So there is a kind of a need for far more study of youth audiences, and I don't think that happens to the extent that it should.
Yeah, actually, a really nice follow-on question from the audience, from Ronan in the audience. Ruth, I'll give this one to you. Should the Commission think in terms of schemes for young creatives to make their own content? Many have the skills, like Sarah was saying there, the 12-year-old in their bedroom, but maybe not the means to tell their own stories.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's what something like Hansh was doing. I don't think it's a silver bullet. I don't think it's the one and only thing that you can do, but I do think that it should be part of the mix. And it's part of how you can upskill. I think the other example that I've found is to think about both encouraging new forms of content that is created and giving them skills and enabling them a space, and working in collaboration with universities, with FE colleges, with schools, because actually a lot of this starts way before 16, 17, 18, right? So the reason why people don't think about working in the creative industries is because nobody's ever told them what it is to have a career in the creative industries. So I think that in many ways, this is a very live debate in Wales, because we are about to enter into a new curriculum, which is very different from the English curriculum. So it puts the expressive arts alongside mathematics and science as compulsory elements. So I think there's something about giving people an opportunity to do a little bit of that work and to create content, but it's also about giving people opportunity and really locking that talent pipeline between FE, HE and industry. And it was certainly something that came across for us around where some of the socioeconomic deprivation was happening, was because that link is in many ways broken and is not being invested in. So for us, one of the arguments we've been trying to make is the Welsh Government has a piece of legislation called the Future Generations Health and Wellbeing Act, which requires all spend and all activity by the Welsh Government to be assessed against what harm it will do or what good it will do future generations. So that's our argument in the sense is if you don't invest in that pipeline, then you're not giving people an opportunity to work in this industry. And that's one of the ways, not the only way, but one of the ways in which the industry can become richer.
Yeah, you talked about recruitment earlier, and if you don't know that pathway, and one of our audience have just said the same, that getting into journalism, he or she thought eventually they would get to RTE, but throughout the year she's realised they've completely closed off there, and the few interactions she's had, it seems entirely impenetrable and distant. So unless you know somebody or have a common pathway with somebody, it can be difficult. Atte, when we're talking about this, you had kind of created a notion of a tension between the over 60s and the younger audiences. Is there kind of courage needed from politicians to break that idea that there is tension there, that actually you can be a public service broadcaster for everybody at the same time?
Yes, I would say that the public service companies need the courage to do this shift. It's not only courage, it also needs very kind of a target-oriented management, which is not easy, because, for example, to change your personnel is not easy, and in some countries almost impossible, and that would actually be needed to do that. So it would the public service companies in many cases would actually need a radical renewal, which is not possible in kind of with soft measures, and being now out of public service already, I can say this openly. I couldn't have said it when I was there, that actually with these cards you can't possibly win. But then I think we also have to understand that it's not only being relevant for younger audiences, and the relation between the audience and the public service institution or company or whatever organization is not only a transactional. It's not only that I get something from this. It's also understanding the core idea of public service, which is that it's also relevant for others, and it joins us together, and we can all see our lives in the content. And that you could see, and we could see that very clearly in the audience surveys we conducted in Finnish broadcasting. If I remember the figures correctly, I would say that 45% of young audiences, which is defined as under 45, finally, were using the content, felt that it was relevant for them. But 90% from them thought that this service is very important and it should exist. And in that way, I feel that the target is that, okay, yes, you have to be relevant for everybody in their own media kind of menu, so that you have the connection, but be open and explain that this is for everybody. And that means that everything is not for everybody, but we have something for everybody, but then we have something for somebody, and then we have something for some groups of the society. And the idea is that we see each other there as well. You see yourself, but then you see other people's lives as well, and you start to understand each other better. And this has a very kind of a high purpose. And if you believe in that, if you believe in the idea of a liberal state and perhaps a nation and democracy, then this is part of a kind of a cloud of ideas that belong together.
Ruth, I saw you nodding there. Do you want to come in on that idea of, maybe the packaging needs to be more honest and transparent and just very open about what a public service broadcaster is?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of public service broadcasters find it very hard to be very honest. And what I mean by that is not that they're dishonest, but that actually they are going to fail. any business is going to fail, any human being is going to fail. So there's such a heightened political atmosphere of hostility to public service media in so many parts of Europe. That in itself is part of the problem. The politicians are part of the problem, right? So we want them to be the solution, but they're also a huge part of the problem. So I think that it's really striking how the problem gets framed. And I know that that can sound like a very academic issue sort of thing, but I'm very struck by how we frame the problem of public service media, for example, in the context of increased competition from Netflix, or the significance of audience ratings, which I think Roberto was talking about earlier on. But what we're much less likely to focus on is competition from YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter, for example. And we still seem much more reluctant to think about feeling confident about the public value of public service media and about the transformation and the necessity of good quality news for citizenship. One of the things that we hear in Wales very frequently is that this weird moment that we got to of increased legislative powers being devolved. And yet at the very moment that there was more devolution, there was less in the way of media coverage, less in the way of news. So there's this kind of disconnect. I'm really interested in the frustration that I hear today with policymakers making decisions and just getting on with it. I think it's because they are part of the problem, and maybe part of the advocacy has to be to think about how we get them to understand that it is their futures that are at risk too. Right? Because if you don't have an informed citizenry, you might also have a citizenry that disengages and doesn't get out there to vote.
And that kind of brings us back to the young person, Sarah. If the politician is disinterested in the young person, therefore they won't see that that's the future. It's kind of the same as the housing crisis that we talk about. If you don't care about the 25-year-old renting, eventually that will be a 45-year-old who will vote.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that in terms of, say, addressing older audiences through public service media, but not younger audiences. And I think if we stay on the path we're on now, that older audience that watches, let's say, broadcast TV is going to age out, and the younger audience that's coming up is going to basically, they're never going to get into public service media. They're never going to buy into it in the first place. It's going to be a much harder proposition to get them on board later on. So I think there is a kind of a real risk that this, I suppose, kind of disaffection with youth, this, disinterest in youth audiences is going to have really bad implications later on. And I think we see some of the implications of that already. We can see that younger people, have a real, I saw some of the public consultations from groups that seem to be very young and very disaffected people who think that public service media is a disaster and we should get rid of it. And that's a real, not only are they disinterested, but they're absolutely hateful towards public service media. And I think that attitude of, why should I pay for something that I don't really consume, is going to increase and increase. Like Roberta said about, Netflix, they see Netflix as more financially valuable and rewarding than public service media. So there needs to be a really good case made about what's distinctive about public service. What is the public service provided to young people? And unless that case is made to them, unless they're really brought in and engaged in it, I think we're going to lose that kind of fight for young audiences.
Ruth, you talked a bit about minority language services doing a lot of heavy lifting in terms of innovation, and we've seen that here with TJ Caher in terms of representation. They would have been the first broadcaster to really get behind women's sport here, and have been broadcasting ladies football for, from when I was younger, which was a huge thing, say, in my life as a sports person when I was younger. But are the risks being asked to be taken by those minority services rather than more risk averse bigger institutions that could be at play here?
Quite possibly. I suppose it's also to do with the fact that minority language media is often, as in the case of S4C, for example, has a political history, right? So it's the result of a very active media audience, a campaign to say, we want this. It also has, I suppose, other political drivers that allows for some advocacy, or for some, if not advocacy, some shared values. So, for example, although S4C is obviously a broadcaster, it operates in a context where it's got a Welsh government that is aiming to get 1 million Welsh speakers by 2050. So there's a particular space, a particular sort of place within the political landscape where it can operate that is quite distinctive, I think, from the mega big kind of institution that is the BBC in its entirety. I think what's very interesting is when you see collaboration between these kinds of institutions. So the instance of back-to-back production that I was alluding to earlier in drama is one example of that. But it's also around distribution, which I think is really important in this conversation. So it's been very interesting to see how S4C's content is now carried on the BBC's iPlayer. Right, so thinking about how that kind of collaboration can happen and can, in a sense, mainstream content. At the same time, I'm very conscious that in Wales, at least, one of the examples that is used for the most successful mainstreaming of the Welsh language is neither S4C nor BBC, but of course, Netflix is The Crown.
Yeah, so again, you're kind of looking at commercial examples of something doing really well, but Atte, as you said, it could be dangerous to try and replicate that. Ronan has a question from the audience that I'm actually going to put to you, Atte. He's asking, as part of the issues that we have, that we need to value our own culture more. Is that something that you would see in Finland, that the public service broadcast, if you are valuing your own culture, you are seeing a more positive response from people of all communities and all ages?
Yes, yes, I would say so. Finland is a very kind of homogeneous culture. We have a small Swedish-speaking minority, and then Sami-speaking in the very small minority in Lapland. But otherwise, the country is very homogeneous, and therefore the issues that, for example, in your area are kind of more visible are not very relevant here. People may come from different parts of the country and speak a little bit different dialect, but they don't really feel that they are different there. They belong to the same nation. But then on the other hand, we have a pretty strong kind of a pride of our national heritage, which I think partly was created by public services in this country. The great story of Finland is not being occupied in the Second World War, and we were, by the way, in war with both Soviet Union and Germany, and we are 5 million people at that time, 4, I guess. And another great story of the country is that we were one of the poorest countries in the world 150 years ago. Now we are among the 10 most wealthy countries, and one of the most educated. So the kind of the story of the nation is a kind of a telling heroic stories of ourselves, and to create this kind of a national pride in a way which I think in these days has become kind of a more modest, especially when Nokia was not anymore the world's biggest mobile phone maker, and Steve Jobs was not beaten by us. But I would say that connecting with your community, which in this case is very much the nation as a whole. We do have regional broadcasting, but the national is much more important. Then connecting with that nation on I would say emotional and identity level is important, because I think in general the value of media is not anymore in what you tell, what the information you can provide, but it's in its ability to connect with people on this deeper level, and to kind of serve the needs of people to be together, create societal kind of a connection. And I would say that looking back to all these decades of public service, that has actually been the core mission of public service, joining people together and creating communities. Everything else is built on top of that: inform and education and entertain and whatever, innovate and be radical and try to be relevant for younger audiences. This community building is the core mission.
We're just running out of time, but Sarah, I just wanted to ask you one last question on just because there's a comment in from somebody in the audience who were talking, but we were just mentioning TJ Carter there and diversity, about them diversifying their offerings to meet younger audiences and talk about their online hub. But younger adults being aged 18 to 30, when do we know when public service broadcasters lose a young audience? Like, I think RTE and TJ Carter do really good work with news for children, but probably not so much obvious stuff for young adults, young teenagers. So when exactly do we lose them, and how do you counter that?
I think, like, I don't know if anybody has any kind of young children, 4 to 5 year olds, but the main platforms for public service media, radio and television and so on, are no longer the go-to platforms for children. Phone is, an iPad is. And so the last thing they get to are those kind of platforms for public service media. And I think that's the point at which they're already seeing, 90% of what they see is something else. So, it needs to be, I think you need to think even earlier than the programs that you put on for a 12-year-old. Already at that point, they've had 8 years of experience of playing games online, and they've had their attention drawn to other things. So I think it needs to be kind of a lifelong kind of commitment to young people, or, in their youth, throughout their lives. So yeah, I think even thinking about 8 years old, 12 years old, 15 years old, they've already kind of probably got a favorite output or favorite outlet at that point, and that's going to be something like YouTube or TikTok.
And we need it to be RTE Baby or something like that. And probably something that Kevin Rafter said earlier, institutions working together. So like maybe one commercial entity or one non-commercial entity can't do it, but maybe 3 or 4 together, like Ruth, you have examples for. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but thank you so much for that discussion, Ruth, Sarah and Atte, and to all of our earlier panels as well. I think it's been a really robust discussion, as Paula Garrity has just said in our Q&A. And it needs to obviously continue, not just through the Future Media Commission, but for the coming years and decades. There will be a rapporteur's report on the Academy's website in a few weeks' time, so keep an eye out for that, and you'll be able to kind of see the main points that are made, especially if you missed any of the earlier panels. So thank you for being with us all afternoon, and have a lovely evening.